See, every time I babysat, like I binged the entire show for like one summer when I babysat last year. Oh my god! Now I take everyone else's HBO, or I go to the library and grab each season and like showing everyone Beef. Like, because what's your feeling on the word robust?
See, my wife is a huge Seinfeld fan, so like I think I could easily convince her to like.
Julia's an icon. Julia's an icon. Now you should watch Beef. You'd like it. You get it. Super raunchy, but the insults are so great. They're so great. I use them all the time.
Like the stuff that you show in class, I'm like, ooh, that's totally Beef. Like some of the weird, obscure, do all the time. I want to raise my hand and be like, Beef.
I'm like, do you get it? And like, but once you said something like was robust, you used the term robust, and like there's a specific line in Beef about just an episode about robust, and it's like the funniest thing about politics ever. And like oh my god, I was dying. You have to watch it.
You can't see the word the same ever again.
Yeah,
you watch
you can never use the word robust without laughing.
That's true.
That's the word in academia, so.
Yeah.
You can't use it.
That's when we were talking about how I don't know what it was. Something about using graphs and how you want to use obscure methods that no one else knows. Like in academia purposes, you're like, well, okay. And then you said something robust, and I just was about to I just had to bite my tongue literally and biting my cheek not to laugh. So.
See, Parks and Rec was my jam for a long time.
That is my jam.
I told you, I was like, he's seen Parks and Rec.
Obviously, he's seen Parks and Rec. But no, Beef is like. I would actually reckon it's probably better, but the casts are better on. Well, no, they're both really great.
We just finished Rings of Power. And we're like
What's
watching
that?
Pandora right now. Like it's.
Can I double check name pronunciation? Alison Gertz. And Maria Aldana?
Yes.
Gertz. Aldana. Connor Taylor? Okay.
Is it Taylor?
I think so.
I would ask.
Taylor. Isn't there an I in there somewhere?
Oh, that's like another. Have you ever seen the substitute thing on Comedy Central? Key and Peele. They're doing name pronunciation, and he taught in inner city for like 10 years. And then, so Aaron was Aaron.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That one? Not you. Yeah. Isn't that?
Tim Murphy.
Oh, yeah. Jake Coen.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I love that one they use.
I found out they have the string already, so once we start talking, they're just going to figure out.
Hey, Aaron, always are calling me.
They do that one at Starbucks. Like every time I say, like, what's the name of Aaron? I'm like, yeah.
Smith could be. It's so. He hasn't watched Beef either. That's surprising.
I'll put it on.
It's a shame. It really is. It's so funny.
It's so good. I cry. I watch every episode 7 times. Just dying of laughter. Like they're just genuinely horrible people, and but it's so good. And they did so much research prior to filming. Like it's actually a lot of things. Like that is so not incorrect at all, but it's so good. Like doesn't even Survivor irritate me? Sometimes it's like it would not bring him there. They would not. It's like protocol, whatever. It's just like so good, and they literally have like interns, like political interns, like interview like congressional interns, and like everything is like cringing, like holding on.
Right on the bar,
doing like everything horrible about it, but it's so.
Do you want to know
No, I'm good. Horrible people too. So.
It's so about nothing.
Like Julia's
Yeah,
the
sure, why not?
character.
Elaine's not bad.
See, I haven't gotten into Seinfeld.
It's better than Friends.
I didn't watch Friends. I didn't like it either.
Friends is overrated.
Sure your phone's on airplane.
That's great. So you should see.
Sometimes I get 60 seconds at a time. Because it's text or whatever.
Mom, I'll call you back. Right.
Thank you all so much for coming out. And for those that are also streaming right now live through our YouTube channel, thank you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Alise Coen, Associate Professor of Political Science here at UW Green Bay, and also Chair of our Public and Environmental Affairs Unit. We're really thankful tonight to the Weidner Center and to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for supporting this event as part of the university's Common Cause annual event series. Common Cause this year focuses on themes of loneliness, connection, and community. Amid an era of heightened globalization and social media use, it may seem counterintuitive that the world is experiencing an isolation problem. But over the last decade, people across an array of countries have reported increasingly feeling a lack of social support and connection. Tonight's panel discussion ties directly into these trends of insularity and disrupted notions of community by exploring how isolation unfolds through polarization and ideological echo chambers in the US political system. We're just weeks away from the midterm elections, so tonight's discussion will also help us imagine some possible strategies for overcoming that isolation through improving electoral participation and dialogue within our local communities. To help us get started with some broader context, studies have suggested that isolation and polarization is a global trend. A Carnegie Endowment report focused on case studies in Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, India, Indonesia, Kenya, Poland, Turkey, and the United States, and found a surprising degree of similarity in the drivers and patterns of polarization. These included polarizing politicians, domestic divisions and demonizing of opponents, the use of social media to amplify divisive rhetoric online, attacks on branches of governments that undermine public trust, abuse of executive power that makes people feel authority only represents one party's supporters, and the shattering of informal norms, that is, social expectations of behavior, around political tolerance and moderation, like conceding peacefully after an electoral defeat, or welcoming people into one's family who vote for an opposing political party. The US did stand out among the case studies, however, for the extent to which our polarization is deeply embedded in a social and cultural conflict between two competing ideologies, conservative and liberal, for visions of how the world should work. To help us understand more about polarization, for the first part of our panel tonight, and why it matters for the US case, as well as for our local communities and everyday lived experiences, we will now turn to our panelists. We have Dr. Aaron Weinshank, the Ben J. and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Political Science, who's also the chair of the Political Science program, and Dr. David Helpap, Associate Professor of Political Science and chair of the Public Administration program. We're also thrilled to have three student panelists tonight: Maria Aldana, a senior, Allison Gertz, also a senior, and Connor Tenner, a sophomore. All three are majors in political science and public administration degree programs. We'll first begin tonight with Dr. Weinshank to help us understand more about what political polarization entails and why it matters for US elections.
Thanks, Alise, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and for being here in person. I just wanted to kind of start by sharing a little bit of information on trends and polarization, get us a definition, and I want to draw a distinction between elite polarization and polarization among ordinary people. I'll talk about each of them. There's some similar trends there, but people conceptualize them in slightly different ways. So I think that when political scientists talk about elites, they're talking about people who serve in office, and there's really no doubt that those people are polarizing at basically every level. If you look at ideological data from roll call votes, which we have complete records of going back to the very first Congress, and you can get them for state legislatures too, the data suggests that Congress is more ideologically polarized now than at any point in US history. That includes the period following the Civil War when we were incredibly polarized. So at no point in history have we been more ideologically polarized. I just wanted to mention too that there's a real thought that the polarization is asymmetrical, meaning that one party has moved faster than the other party. Pretty much all the data that you look at on the ideology of parties in Congress shows that Republicans have moved to the right faster than Democrats have moved to the left. And I just wanted to mention too that if you look at in the Wisconsin state legislature, again, you can use roll call votes to figure out the ideologies of parties and figure out what the averages are. What you find is there's a huge gap in Wisconsin. In fact, we're the 6th most polarized state. We're even more polarized than the US Congress. And so that makes it difficult for the people who say if Congress isn't working, go to the state legislature, because the state legislature is even more polarized than Congress. And you probably, if you've paid any attention to politics, know that it's very hard to get things through the Wisconsin state legislature and signed by the governor. So just to jump to the public level, I think what people are mostly paying attention to these days in political science is something called affective polarization, which is like, how do people who are in parties feel about the parties that they're not a part of? And there's some really interesting data. For a few decades now, people have been asking in surveys feeling thermometers about how you feel about your own party. Not surprisingly, people feel pretty warmly about their own party. They would give it a score of, on average, 80 out of 100 on a 0 to 100 scale. If you go back to like the 1980s, you'll find that people rated the out party at about a 50 or so kind of in the middle of the scale. These days, in some of the most recent polls that have been done, people rate the out party somewhere in the 20s. Right? So there's been a big drop in how people feel about people in the other party, and I think this has to do with a bunch of different things. One of the things I think is the nature of media coverage, where we've reduced really complicated issues down to a couple seconds, and people sort of operate on caricatures. I think people also have a lot of stereotypes about what people in the other party are like. There's been some really interesting studies looking at asking Democrats to say what share of the party makes over $250,000, and people are way off in their estimates. And basically every characteristic you ask them, they way overshoot. It's something like 2% of Republicans make over $250,000, but if you ask Democrats, they'll say it's 30%, right? And so people have these misperceptions that they use to think about other parties. And then the third thing I think is that people often aren't that tuned into politics, and so they look for cues about what to do, how to behave, and so elites have been polarizing, and people have picked up on that, and that sort of guides their own thinking and their own behavior. So definitely elites have polarized, and definitely the public has polarized. For a long time, there was a debate about whether the public was polarizing alongside the public. I don't think there's really any question about that. In fact, if you look at Pew data on issue positions among Democrats and Republicans over time, you'll find that there's a much bigger gap now than there was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think it's definitely the case that the public is polarizing, and people are viewing the other party as much more negative, they're much more fearful of the other party. So that's kind of my overview of polarization, some basic trends, and I'll stop there. And happy to answer more questions about that when we get to the end of the panel.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Next, we'll turn to Dr. David Helpap to help us understand how political polarization impacts local level politics in our communities.
Thank you, Alise, and thank you for everyone for attending and for viewing. So there's this old adage that all politics is local, but more often over the last 5 to 10 years or so, that really has not been the case. More and more often we see that local level, so city council, county board, and as I'll discuss in a second, even school board races, and politics are really being defined by issues that are more commonly discussed and are at the center of partisan politics at the state and national levels. So just broadly, more recently, some of these issues have included COVID-19 responses and vaccine policies, election integrity issues, the January 6th Capitol riot, and education reform. And there are others, but these have been some of the most prominent. So this type of nationalization of local races really has translated into political participation as well. And there are some excellent examples right here in Brown County and in Northeast Wisconsin. So in terms of a few of those, so during the most recent Green Bay City Council elections, for example, the candidates who were running were the focus of 2 national level interest groups that are very active at the state and national level, but now moving down into the local level as well. These included the Restoration PAC and then Open Democracy PAC. The former is largely aligned with Republican politics and funded by the Uline family. whereas the latter is more closely aligned with democratic politics and funded by organizations really from across the country. So in terms of the spending, Restoration PAC spent nearly $80,000 in those races on brochures and ad buys, whereas Open Democracy spent $200,000 on races in Brown County and then a few other communities across Wisconsin. So in Brown County, those races included the Brown County Board, the Green Bay City Council, and also the De Pere City Council. So you see a number of different elections being impacted there. Other activities included billboards, TV commercials, digital ads, and state political parties got involved as well in terms of campaign donations and being actively involved in campaigning. So it's really sort of difficult to determine the impact of spending, but 5 candidates that were supported by Restoration PAC won their races, 3 of which unseated incumbents, which is not something that's particularly easy to do, even at the local level. And I should mention at this point that all local level municipal races in Wisconsin are nonpartisan. So when those folks are on the ballot, there is no partisan affiliation behind their name. And even like even a few $1,000 donations can be a big deal for these types of races, typically. And for better or worse, the Green Bay situation was featured in Politico, which is a national level media outlet for really the partisanship and the division that occurred within these races. So fortunately or unfortunately, the Green Bay area, and Wisconsin more broadly, this isn't the most local of races where this type of polarization has occurred. It has occurred even at the school district level. Particularly in the Milwaukee area, they receive significant attention from state and local elected officials. As an example, former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Kleefisch endorsed more than 100 school board candidates during that election cycle. And in these cases, the focus was on responses to COVID-19 and the ways in which various topics are taught, particularly related to gender, LGBTQ+ issues, parental rights, and the content of educational materials like books. So in total, the state Republican Party spent over $70,000 on school board elections across the state. And the Democratic Party spent another $10,000 plus. Typically, candidates in school board races raise a few $100s, and that's it. And now they're up to between $2,000 and $8,000 just to try to win and compete in races like this. This situation isn't unique to Wisconsin. So these typically sort of low-key, low-information races are receiving increased attention across the country. Maryland, Texas, Florida. And in most cases, these resources are coming from national level groups that are more focused, or typically have been more focused on national level partisan issues.
Thank you so much, David. And next we're going to turn to Maria, Connor, and Allison to ask how it is that we actually encounter political polarization in our everyday lives. Some examples of what that actually looks like that you all have experienced.
One way that I see polarization in our everyday life is honestly like the products that we buy and see in the stores. For example, if you know that one company or brand has a certain point of view associated with them, you'll see like certain parties typically buy that product more, or you'll see the other side like boycott it completely. There's like numerous examples in the past, like a couple years alone, honestly. And that can kind of go in the same way as like celebrity endorsements. So if you really like a celebrity and they endorse something, and they stand a certain way or lean one way or the other, you'll see their stocks and their goods of that product increase. And if you're the other way, you'll not buy that product and find something else, even if it might be more or less expensive. You might go the extra mile to pick something else in the store if you know how that organization or person leans.
For me, the one that sticks out the most regarding polarization would probably be the media. Irregardless of the source, you can kind of find a way, both parties, well, not parties, but certain outlets will lean a specific way, which regarding topics that might be fairly mundane have become incredibly political or just attention grabbing, which kind of goes back to like funding purposes. It's
Kind of going off of that, I think social media is a major catalyst of political polarization. I think it gives us both the platform to share our political views and then also like shape what viewpoints we're exposed to. Like it's really easy if someone shares something on social media that I disagree with, I can just go and unfriend them. If there's a page that shares something that I don't like, I can go and unlike their page. And so it's really easy to kind of create a bubble where you only see viewpoints that you like and then kind of move away from ones that you don't, which I think can kind of further that polarization.
Thank you all so much. And I'll just briefly illustrate how polarization and isolation within echo chambers impacts an area of policy that I study in my own research, which is immigration policy. And for some context, an August 2022 Pew study found that Republicans and Democrats are increasingly dehumanizing each other, describing members of the opposing party as, quote, immoral, unintelligent, close-minded, and dishonest. With such views of partisan opponents, political parties aren't merely vehicles of articulating policy positions, but operate more powerfully as social groups of inclusion and exclusion. And as part of excluding partisan opponents as immoral, unintelligent, or dishonest members of an outgroup, meaningful dialogue and compromise becomes much more challenging. So this is manifested in immigration politics. A Gallup poll released in August of this year found Americans highly fractured over views of immigration policy based on partisan identity. When asked whether immigration levels should be decreased, over 2/3 of Republicans, 69%, said yes. For the same question, less than 1/5 of Democrats, or 17%, agreed. Gallup has been asking this question for a while, and the division between Republicans and Democrats was much smaller in the past. Back in 2004, Democrats and Republicans were just about 10 points apart in believing that less immigration would be better for the country. By 2014, that division had grown to 14 points, and by 2016 to 38 points. The current 50-point difference, or actually 52-point difference, is the greatest division that the Gallup poll ever recorded for that question on immigration. So how can two partisan communities have such strikingly different views of immigration? This traces back to the concept of ideological echo chambers, like Connor was saying, becoming in a bubble. In the echo chamber effect, political beliefs are amplified by the circulation and repetition of ideas within a closed system. This means other relevant voices with alternative points of view are actively excluded and discredited. So members of these echo chambers are not only exposed less to other arguments, they're actually systematically discrediting and distrusting outside sources. People's beliefs are easily insulated from rebuttal, and it becomes easy to isolate oneself within the ideological bubble. Part of this unfolds through how and where people get their information about immigration issues and how they isolate themselves in ideological silos. Maria was mentioning media as a really great example of how she encounters polarization in everyday experience, and studies have found a strong relationship between Fox News consumption and policy preferences favoring restriction on immigrants. So someone following immigration from a really conservative media outlet today is likely to encounter very negative stories about immigrants, people who are illegal, people who are a burden on social welfare, immigrants as criminals, immigration as a cultural invasion, and other modes of framing and packaging immigration as something dangerous and threatening to the American way of life. In contrast, someone who is consuming immigration news following the social media accounts of Democratic politicians, the ACLU, or media organizations that tend to package information for a more liberal audience, is likely to hear more positive stories about immigrants as part of the fabric of American history, hardworking, industrious people who pay taxes and contribute to the economy, or as vulnerable people who have sympathetic stories for how and why they arrived in the country. In that sense, it becomes easy for liberal and conservative communities to inhabit two very different realities about what immigration means, who immigrants are, and in relation to what America means and who Americans are. Within these echo chambers and silos, it makes sense then that Republicans and Democrats view their partisan opponents as immoral people who are trying to destroy their cherished vision of the country and which values they hold most dear. For instance, being welcoming and compassionate towards people seeking a better or safer life, which resonates with liberal communities, or protecting and defending what they perceive as traditional American society, law and order, national security, which resonate more with conservative communities. Politicians' rhetoric about immigration and refugees, as I find in my own work, increasingly binds up these values and notions of identity with certain policy stances. So it becomes more than just a policy debate, it becomes a divisive debate over one's own feeling of belonging. Alternative arguments or different points of view can then become understood as threatening one's own sense of identity. This encourages dismissiveness, mockery, antagonism, and higher levels of incivility towards partisan opponents, fueling polarization and dehumanization as a cycle. So finding ways to have meaningful dialogue on immigration policy has become today harder than ever before. So to help with this conundrum that we've highlighted across the panelists so far, our second part of the panel is now going to turn to some more hopefully positive ideas for improving community participation, improving engagement, and improving dialogue. We'll begin with looking at the issue of voter turnout, based on Dr. Weinschenk's research and expertise, to learn more about what factors have shown to improve electoral participation in the US and other countries.
Thanks, Alise. So I just wanted to hit on a few possible ideas for things we could do at the national level and at the state and local levels to increase voter turnout. There are actually lots of things we could do. There's also lots of things we could do that would actually save us money and would be good if you're concerned about things like efficiency. So one of the things that we are almost certain would work was same-day voter registration. In Wisconsin, we have the luxury of being able to register to vote on the same day if we decide to, the same day of the election. We're only one of about a dozen states that have that. There are some states where you have to register to vote 30 days before the election. So if you decide on day 28 before the election that you would like to vote and you live in a state where it's 30 days out, you can't vote in that election. One of the things we could do is all the states that don't have same-day registration could have it. Now, I don't think that's likely to happen, but it would almost certainly increase voter turnout. The states, if you calculate the average turnout in the states that have same-day registration, it's significantly higher than the states that don't have it. So that's one pretty easy reform that we could do. Some states are talking about it, some states are considering it. We'll see how many other states implement it. Another thing we could do related to the timing of election is we could have local elections at times when there's other exciting elections going on. We tend to have local elections especially in Wisconsin, in weird months like February and April, where there's no presidential election, no governor's election, no Senate election, or anything like that, right? We are almost certain that if we shifted the time of elections in the local context to be on cycle with presidential midterm elections, voter turnout would increase. In fact, California around 2015 passed a law that required all municipalities to hold their elections concurrently with some other high-profile election, a presidential primary, something like that, and not surprisingly, turnout went up. Right. Also, there have been lots of cities that have done this. Virginia Beach, for example, previously held their local elections in a presidential year, but not on the day of a presidential election, which is not really a great idea, because then you have to go vote twice. Right. Then they decided we should do it on the same day, and turnout went up about 40 percentage points. Right? So more and more places could do that. I remember giving a talk to a bunch of neighborhood groups in this area. There were a bunch of city council members there, and I pitched that as an idea because lots of people in the local context are thinking about ways to get more people involved, and it had never even occurred to them that we could do this. Right? They just thought, well, those were like handed down from the heavens. Those are the dates that elections have to occur, right? We could change them if we wanted to. I also just want to talk a little bit about civics because this is something I'm really interested in. I think we do civics all wrong in the United States. I think we administer it too late and we don't repeat it. I like to tell my classes it's like trying to teach a little kid manners. You don't just tell them one time and then they get it, right? Like if you want your kid to say thank you after getting something, you have to remind them like 50 million times before it becomes a habit. Right? The same goes for civics. We tend to do it when people are older, like at junior and high school. We do one semester, that's it, then they should be good democratic citizens and know everything, right? Compare that to other subjects where students do it every year. They reinforce it over time, right? So I think we need to start that kind of stuff earlier, and we need to do it more, repeat it more frequently. One dose of civics is probably not going to be enough. In fact, my research, which has tracked people over really long periods of time and matched their turnout records with transcripts to see how many courses they've taken, shows that the number of courses they've taken in high school has no effect on later voter turnout, even 10 years down the line. The types of classes don't matter either, right? Because if you just give people one dose of it, it's probably not going to have a big effect, right? Maybe we need to start it in middle school or elementary school, but we definitely need to repeat it over and over again, right? Just teaching it one time in one class is probably not going to be enough. And then I just also wanted to mention that there's some people doing really innovative things regarding voter registration in high schools. So some schools are actually partnering with local election officials to teach students in high school about how to register to vote or to get them to register so that when the next election comes around and they're 18, they're all set to go. So I think there are interventions like that that could work really well in addition to reforming civics. So yeah, I'll stop there with other ways and happy to talk more about other things you've heard about or those as well.
Thank you so much, Aaron. One question which is flowing from this is how we can elaborate on improving the local level electoral participation right here in our surrounding communities. So to help us think about that question, we'll now turn to Dr. Helpap.
Thank you. So I think often the local level is where citizens really can have the most impact on the services with which they interact with daily. We tend to see that impact in a more real way when we think about local government at the county level, the city level. I mean, there's no doubt that the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act or Act 10 or decisions by the state legislature impact us, but at the same time, we know when our streets are plowed, right? We know when that pothole is filled. We know when the grass has been mowed at the soccer field that our kids are playing in. We see those services in a very real way. And at the local level, there's also lots of opportunities to get information. So, the minutes for meetings, agendas, they're published online, they're available. You also have an opportunity to participate very regularly. So you can vote, but at the same time, you can also email comments to local elected officials. Most city websites have forms where you can direct comments about infrastructure or issues you might be having. Some communities you can even do budgeting type games where you can tell your city which services you prioritize and how much money should go toward them. So there are lots of opportunities to participate, but at the local level, we tend to see lower levels of participation. And so people aren't always taking advantage of these opportunities. So I think where we can come up with some solutions, particularly at the local level, is that citizens tend to get the most involved at this level when the issues directly affect them. And this gives elected officials this opportunity to really illustrate and highlight how local level services, municipal services, really impacts our lives on a daily basis. Again, infrastructure quality, park quality, social welfare services at the county level. I mean, these are the services that you are really going to be receiving, interacting with on a daily basis. So I think for elected officials, it's really important to focus on that, to tell people that your participation matters here, because participation in municipal city council races, 10%, 20%, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, but it's definitely not even close to what we see at a national level. I think there's also a good opportunity to actually participate and run for office at this level. We have a lot of races just in Brown County, even recently, that are uncontested. People aren't running for these races. I recently completed a survey last spring, in fact, of local elected officials and appointed officials in rural communities. And a bit of a surprising finding was that so many of those officials commented on the lack of participation from people in their community, that no one was attending meetings, and some of them outright said that I'm 75 years old, the other people on this board are 75 years old, we're probably going to hold these positions until we die, and then no one is going to run for them. So even in smaller communities, there's just not that interest in running and being part of the process. And I think the key there is really sort of reaching out to individuals and telling them why politics and services at this level are particularly important.
Thank you so much, David. And one issue that we've recently heard a lot about for the upcoming midterm elections is that voter turnout and participation is expected to be particularly low among younger age groups. So we'll now turn to Maria, Allison, and Connor to help us think about some ideas for how could we boost participation and voting in the elections, especially among younger age groups.
So I believe there's a multitude of ways to improve voter turnout, specifically amongst younger people, but I believe you should start them young, so to say. Families and even schools should reiterate the importance of the civic duty and importance of voting, as well as just simply the concern is registering citizens to vote in the first place. So, like you said, expanding same-day voter registration, or even automatic voter registration is a way to see improvement, or even making it compulsory is my recommendation.
To kind of go off what was already said, about like a third of the states right now have pre-registration when you're 16. And I think maybe like expanding that to all states. Wisconsin currently doesn't have that. You can register like depending on when your birthday lies and like when the next election is when you're 18. So I think just like expanding that program would help, obviously with civics being like repeated multiple times and not just once in high school, that's another opportunity for that. So passing that and getting that change in all states, and also like having that age group understand that there's like more options than just voting on election day. So like early voting and absentee voting, specifically like that age that's like prime college age students. So like they're not at home to vote on election day. Like I live an hour and a half away, so I would have to drive on a random Tuesday back an hour and a half. And that's just not like realistic in a lot of people's minds. So for example, like I already voted absentee last week. So that's like one way to get people more engaged in voting, is just realizing that there's more options than just same-day voting.
I think everyone pretty much covered what I was going to say, but going off of same-day voter registration, I think that's a really important step that can be taken, because young people especially tend to move around a lot more than older adults, graduating high school, moving to college, graduating college, starting a career somewhere. So I think that is a really good way to make it easier for young people to get involved. And then also, sorry. Sorry, completely lost my train of thought. But yeah.
Thank you so much. We'd like to now, with these insights across all the panelists, open things up to the audience here to ask some questions. You can also share if you have thoughts you want to contribute for reducing polarization, reducing isolation, or improving community engagement with the elections. But yeah, we'll open it up to you all, and I think we can hear everyone just fine. So we'll start over here, Marcelo.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having this. I came in a tad late, so I didn't hear all of Erin's first interventions. I do apologize for that. something that came out in your panel too. It's not about discussing policy. It's making sure that the other party doesn't win. Something like the demonizing aspect of it. And that's was quite striking for me, because any type of reapproachment you would have is to talk about policies. And that doesn't seem to be the number one issue among voters. And that is quite disturbing. It's just demonizing the other side, and also the notion that medias have been, now that we have 24-hour news, before everyone used to listen to the same evening news with Walter Cronkite or Chet Huntley. Now it's your choice of how you get your news. And a lot of the news is more commentary than it is news. Either it's MSNBC or it's Fox and anything in between, huh? Trying to surmount that seems to be very difficult. And what's striking also is how fast we got to this situation. You yourselves brought out that only about 15 years ago, the country was very different than it is now as far as polarization goes. And my second point is this. I'm making votes easier. I'm kind of struck that none of you thought about what other countries do, in fact, the vast majority of countries do, have election day on a Sunday instead of a working day. If you have it on a Sunday, it's a lot easier than trying to vote on a Tuesday in which you got to get kids to school and dinner on the table and so forth. So.
I'll just talk a little bit about the lack of issue concern. I always like to, it's the politicians who are like running the ads that don't have many issues in them, right? I always think it's like partly our fault because we reward the people who do this, right? Like if you look at, like we have the possibility of getting rid of every single person in the House of Representatives every 2 years. We don't even come close to doing that, right? It's something like 98.8% reelection rates. People complain all the time about the way campaigns are run, the things that politicians are doing or not doing, and then they reelect the same people over and over again. If you go back and look at the incumbency reelection rate for 30 years, you'll find the lowest it's ever dipped is in the low 80s, which 80% of incumbents getting reelected is not a real strong sign that you don't like what they're doing, right? So I think part of it is our own problem. Like we reward the people who do this, right?
And I just want to speak to the media piece too. One of the things that I had thought about mentioning in my second response is sort of local media and the way that local media has changed over time, and really the absence of local media, where newspapers now, even whether it's in print or online, they're largely owned by national media companies. And a lot of the material that gets put into those is a reflection of national stories, and which is fine, but most communities have very few reporters ever at their council meetings, at their board meetings, where this was really sort of the primary news for quite a long time. So now in Brown County, around the Green Bay area, there's a newspaper that sort of defines itself as hyper-local to try to distinguish itself, but many communities aren't that fortunate, where again, you have lots of opportunities to view these things, but no one is reporting on them. And then as citizens, if we don't have that type of information, that can be challenging to keep local officials accountable, but also just to be informed on what might be coming. You have to take it on yourself to do that. And is that reasonable for most people, for young people, for people who have families, who are busy? It becomes much harder when there aren't several outlets to access that information.
And I'll just speak for a moment on the global context. So some things that other countries do that increase voter turnout is that people are automatically registered to vote. They don't have to take the extra step of going and filling out paperwork, which no one likes to do. And they're just automatically, as part of their citizenship, registered to vote. There are also some countries where it is compulsory, and there may be trouble even getting utilities if they don't show their card with the stamp that they voted in the election. I know there are some European countries that if you do not vote for maybe 15 years, they remove you from the roster as punishment and as an incentive, a kind of a stick approach to keep active in voting. And other countries where it is a national holiday, like Marcella was saying, maybe even on a Sunday, or maybe just having that day be a holiday so no one has to work. So yes, other countries have been very creative, and when we compare the US to other countries, we have one of the lowest voter turnout rates for any democracy that regularly holds elections. So we're not doing very well, even though we like to think of American exceptionalism and being the best at things, but we're actually one of the worst at voter turnout. Do you all have any thoughts on Marcelo's question?
I was going to say the same thing about mandatory voting and the federal holiday, so no.
Okay, well, thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, I'm wondering, so I have two young kids, 11 and 12, and both of them the last few months have been, like everyone else, inundated with ads, often very hostile and aggressive ads about particular candidates. And so I've been thinking about sort of what the impact of that is on them and how they end up feeling about politics and about government. And it feels like the creative, I mean, this is not new, right? I mean, it's been happening for a long time, but that culture of sort of hostility surrounding this ends up making this process feel really distasteful. And I wonder, and so I guess the question would be, are there things that other countries do that sort of where campaigns are handled, whether it's more civil or whether the campaign season is shorter or things like that? And I apologize, I too missed the very beginning of this, so maybe that's where all the questions I have are answered. I don't know. Is there a way to end that or have that process be different?
Yeah, there's definitely countries that restrict the amount of time that people can campaign before an election. Like some are really, really strict. Like it can only go for 1 month prior to an election. Right? In the U.S., it's like as soon as there's a presidential election, it feels like it's happening again immediately, and people are already talking about the candidates. But there's places that have a really narrow window. There's also places that have been like quite successful in keeping money out of politics, which I think is part of the issue with the number of outside groups that run ads and that people aren't able to differentiate from candidates, even though they say in little text on the bottom. So there have been countries that have been successful at those kind of things.
Do you all have any thoughts on how to reduce the hostile feeling around voting?
I don't have any specific thoughts, but I can definitely like relate to the negative connotation that is like associated with those ads. I mean, I watch them to myself, and I can definitely see how any voters, but specifically like young voters, can just be turned off, especially if that's like the first election that they're voting in. They might feel overwhelmed, or because both ads are saying extremely negative things about each other. So I can definitely relate to that like feeling of just overall negativity from both sides.
I think I'm an anomaly. Ever since I was a young kid, I've always enjoyed political ads, but I think it could potentially intrigue them at a young age, which that might be a good or bad thing in the long term, depending on how politics goes. But
no. Yeah, the only thing that came to mind was in other countries, sometimes there are multi-party coalitions, and there are even things like ranked choice voting. So there are other ways of doing it where then the campaign ads really shouldn't be so attacky and negative, because they aren't sure, I might actually be in a runoff with this person or need to work with this person. So it's really hard because we have this two-party system. But if we had more third-party candidates, or if the system could be restructured to encourage that kind of thing, maybe we could de-escalate the hostility a bit. Other questions? Yes.
So I recently went through social media training, and example, on TikTok, to have a successful video, it needs to be less than like 37 seconds in length. In my opinion, that's not enough to provide any kind of substance. That's just going to be something short, quippy, and memorable. Combine that with echo chambers, do you think this leads us to a place where the disagreements aren't on policy, but rather what the facts are? And what can we do about that?
And I'll just kick us off with that because I was reading a study about, comparing the polarization across those 8 country cases I introduced us with, and that was one thing they all had in common, was that social media had been a root cause of increasing hostility and antagonism and antipathy. And it is a problem because a lot of the most shareable things are overly simplistic, right? If you think of tweets or posts, whatever it is, or TikTok videos, they're overly simplistic, and they're going to get more shares and they're going to get more engagement if they're also really tuning into mockery and snarkiness. And that's actually the opposite of having a civil dialogue that humanizes other points of views, but that's actually what will go most viral and be most successful. So social media has been identified as one of the root, or I guess we would say, we don't want to maybe say root cause, because I feel like that puts too much on it, because we are using it. We are people that are using social media, but it's amplifying it so much more. Do other people have thoughts about the social media aspect?
So when I teach public policy analysis, and one of the weeks we talk about agenda setting. So how do issues get from sort of this nebulous thing that only a few people are talking about to get to a point where they might actually have a chance of being solved. And one of the questions I was posed to the class is what role has social media played in agenda setting, in getting these issues in front of people? And the response almost every time is that social media allows issues to become much more forefront, that issues that wouldn't normally be there. So it allows people to get attention for their issues. But at the same time, it is much harder to keep them on the agenda because there are so many more issues out there. There's so much more competition for attention that you may have a few days, you may have a few weeks, you may have a few months, but there's always that next thing that's readily available to people who are consuming social media. So in some sense it makes it easier, but in some sense it makes it much harder, just at that stage of the process. Not just in what you're talking about in terms of facts and policy. That's something else entirely even.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I think that we experience the shortness in social media, but like studies have looked at the amount of coverage in like nightly news programs devoted to politics, and it's dwindled over time, right? Like I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but we reduce really complicated issues to like a 2-minute news story. Well, you can't really get a lot of understanding of bunch of different perspectives and the intricacies of a policy and the solutions in 2 minutes, right? And then people often operate on the 2 minutes as if they're an expert, right? And so I think that like it happens elsewhere too, where just the amount of time we spend covering things goes down, because as Professor Helpap said, there's fights for what to cover, right? There's always a million things that could possibly be covered, and so how do we get a bunch of stuff in within a 30-minute news program or something like that? So I think that kind of thing happens in regular media or like traditional media as well.
Any thoughts on social media?
I mean, I agree, it's good in a way that it gets important issues out into the open and talked about, but like everyone else said, the news cycle is just so fast that in 24 hours there's another crisis that's happening.
I agree with Allison and everything else is stated as well.
Yeah, and I guess going off of that, we love little snippets. We love something that we can read in like 15, 20 seconds. We don't necessarily go on Facebook with the intention of like reading an in-depth news article. And so, yes, social media is really good at like bringing things to our attention that we might not otherwise see or know about, but it can also lead to the spread of a lot of misinformation, and like or sometimes I'll see people like share a news article like it's something that's happening today when really the article's from 3 years ago, but they just saw the headline and they were like, oh my gosh, and then they share it. and then you go in the comment section and it's like the same thing. So yeah, I don't think there's really an easy answer to like how to combat that, but I think it is definitely kind of a blessing and a curse.
One final thought on that is we've really been conditioned, I think, to turn to these, both the 24-hour news cycle, as Aaron was saying, and social media for entertainment. So, you know, if we're going to have to work really hard because those corporations have conditioned us and we have conditioned ourselves to be in the habit of wanting something short, shareable, quick, fun, exciting, adrenalizing, but we have to work really hard to form new habits to actually want to educate and do deep dives. So we're going to have to do that because the corporations and social media companies, you know, news corporations are not going to do that. We have to demand that. Let's see, we'll go first to the gentleman here.
So well, we're close to an election, and most of what you talked about was like talking about like electoral politics and like the election. But how do we get like involved in the community? How do we get people involved in the government and community outside of electoral politics? Because it seems like after the election is over, most people stop caring. So, and you think that like us not getting involved in like government or community outside of electoral politics and only caring about that like contributes to political polarization?
I think that, yeah, I do think that that is a tendency where like we do our best work in presidential elections and then we sort of forget about politics. Some people call it like political hobbyism. And I do think that like there's all kinds of opportunities to be involved in the process outside of elections, but people often don't know about them, don't think about them, have other things they prioritize. So Professor Helpap mentioned serving in local elected capacities. There's also lots of localities that have boards where you're not elected, you're appointed and approved by the mayor and the council. I always tell my students, like, if you're into the environment, join the Parks and Recreation one. Like, I serve on the ethics board. There's lots of ways to contribute to civic life without running for office if you don't want to do that. So I think there's things like that. I mean, I also show my students regulations.gov. You can comment on any regulation you want, right? At any point in time, you can go read all the regulations that are going to be published. You can comment on them. You get to see the responses, what other people commented on, right? You can work for a political party outside of an election if you're concerned about different ideas, if you want to try to recruit different candidates. So I do think that there's lots of opportunities outside, but we sort of get hyped up around presidential elections because they're exciting and there's lots of money and the candidates come around the country and visit, but we need to pay attention beyond those kind of events.
Yeah, to go along with that, I think what you see is that, you know, people will participate, they will go and vote in that presidential election, and then they've done their civic duty. You know, like I've completed what I need to do, and now I can sort of move on with my life. And this is the struggle that sort of off-cycle elections have, as Professor Weinschenk was talking about, where you have these local level elections and they matter a lot, but people don't get as excited about them. They don't get as motivated. It's not the Super Bowl of elections, so, you know, what is the point of participating? But in reality, like, all elections matter. All policies matter. They affect us on our daily lives, and we need that sort of level of attention throughout the year and throughout the election cycle.
I agree with a lot of what's been said already. But I think even if you don't want to run for like a local position, at a very simple level, you can either like attend your school board or city council meetings and just, you don't even have to voice your opinion, just like sit in and see what they have to say. And if you do want to comment on something, then by all means go for it. But that's just an extremely like entry-level way to get even more involved in government outside of just voting in elections.
Okay, and the person in the gray.
So you guys were talking a lot about how we need to get more involved on issues at the local level or get more involved in local level government.
You can watch the city council meetings and all the committee meetings are live streamed on YouTube. So you can be doing some other task and just listen to them on your headphones, right? Like you can read everything on your own time, watch things on your own time. Like, I don't think any of us would say like devote every minute of your free time to politics, right? But like pick something you're passionate about and get involved in it. Maybe it's writing a letter. Maybe it's going to a city hall meeting when an issue comes up that is important to you. So I think those kind of things are important, even if you don't have a ton of time.
Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think, Dr. Weinschenk said it well, is that there are lots of different opportunities to participate. There are opportunities at different times. So some communities have meetings in the afternoons, some communities have meetings in the evenings, but most of them now are recorded. Sometimes to the chagrin of people who are actually like in the meetings. But the minutes are there, so you can participate, you can get involved. And it could just be to advocate for an issue. You don't have to go to every single committee meeting, but if there's something that on the agenda that's important to you, go and speak to it. Go to that planning meeting, go to that hearing, and it's 20 minutes maybe, but it gives you the opportunity to have your voice heard. And a lot of times, if there aren't a lot of other people there, yours is the voice that's going to be heard. And there's that adage that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and in some cases, that's true. So be the squeaky wheel, I guess.
And I would just add that, it doesn't only have to be engagement in local politics. It can also be being politically informed throughout the year. And I think that's also a form of being engaged. So you could just have 10 minutes of the day every day when you will go and do some deep dives into what's happening, globally and locally. And that it could be something that you choose which outlets you feel are trustworthy and that you like getting that information on what's happening in global politics and local politics, rather than what the social media algorithm is going to suggest you read. That would be my advice for year-round, staying engaged. Do y'all have any ideas?
As mentioned, I would suggest research, actively choosing to be an active global citizen and an active, just in civic participation in general, as well as requesting an absentee ballot. If you can't physically go in person, you can request for any election to vote by mail. But I think, as Dr. Coen eloquently mentioned, that actively looking for information in order to better your community is a good way to start.
I think this could also kind of tie back into providing better civic education in K through 12. In high school, I don't think I really learned anything about local politics. Right now I'm taking a class called the Civic Scholars Leadership Program, and so throughout the fall semester we go and meet with different government agencies, nonprofits, around the city of Green Bay. So tomorrow I'm going to the mayor's office. Last week we visited with Downtown Green Bay Inc. We met with a city planner, and just getting to talk to these people who are doing super cool things in the city, it's gotten me more interested in local politics. I had never thought at all about what goes into city planning or revitalizing a downtown area, but just having these meetings and discussions with people has definitely gotten me more interested in local politics. So I think if high schools or middle schools could figure out a way, instead of taking a field trip to I don't know where kids go on field trips these days, but take a field trip to go meet with the mayor or something like that, just to know okay, this is what is happening where I live, and these are the issues that these people deal with. I think you can't care about something if you don't know that it exists, I guess.
Yeah, well said, Connor. The person in the blue?
Okay. How can we embrace diversity and how can we respect for diversity? So what we can do. So I'm also studying some kind of political polarization, and I could find out this. Someone talked about misinformation, which I have quite a lot of interest. But misinformation and disinformation misinformation, they know that this is truly false information, but if that information might be congruent with their political belief, they just consume it. So, and the fact does not matter. So I think that whether it is factual or not does not matter. So I think this kind of consuming misinformation can strengthen the political polarization. So what I can suggest at this moment is do not take everything at face value and check, verify well. But I want to know how can we embrace the diversity and how can we respect for the diversity.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one way to have more diverse points of view is to build a habit of going to different news outlets that have a different background, ideological background maybe, or the audiences of them are very different. And that's a way that you can kind of train yourself to see the different kinds of viewpoints that coexist around an issue and to humanize, different people. It's not that everyone who disagrees is unintelligent or, like the study found, immoral. It's just that they have a different way of understanding it, which they actually think is the most moral, most just way of understanding it. So it could even be like reading 3 different news outlets, in your 15 minutes that you're going to read news that are very ideologically diverse. So that would be one idea I have on that.
At the local level, a number of cities, quite a few cities, I think, have made the move to specifically target groups that they want to get involved. So so sending out community surveys in a variety of different languages, depending upon your community, having public meetings where people are, where people live. So rather than having everything at City Hall, have a community planning meeting at a local community center or a religious institution, having people there that can translate. So reaching out specifically to groups, especially when those groups are going to be affected by the decisions that are made, again, by planning, by public safety, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I'm going to interpret it as like diversity of opinions and thoughts and attitudes. And the reason I want to talk about it in that way is because there's been a lot of talk about whether the lack of socialization amongst members of Congress is something that underpins polarization. So there's this idea that like in the 50s, members of Congress used to like get to know each other. Their families would spend time together, and like the 50s was like the most bipartisan collaborative era in recent memory in the Senate, most productive. And these days, they've set the schedule in such a way that like they hardly spend any time there. They just go for a few days, then fly back to the district. They don't spend very much time in DC, so there's not much time to socialize. And also the parties put a lot of pressure on them to not mingle with people of the other party, right? There's stories of members of Congress being punished by like being removed from things that they were entitled to in committees, like chairmanships, because they were caught like working with a Democrat or working with a Republican. I'll never forget, some of you were in my class, Eden was in my class, we brought in a member of the Republican Party state legislature last spring, and somebody asked, how often do you socialize with members of the other party? And he said, never, absolutely never, because I don't want to get caught somebody taking a photo or a video of me with a Democrat, because that'll make its way back up to party leadership. So I think that like making an effort to socialize or changing norms around socialization would be good, but making an effort to like get to know views. It's hard to work with somebody on a piece of legislation if you don't know anything about them and why they believe what they believe, right? And like what experiences they've had. So at the congressional or state legislative level, I think that would go a long way.
Ideas for diversity.
I agreed that a great and relatively easy way is to diversify your news sources. So look at Fox and CNN. A lot of the times they'll have the exact like same news stories, but their content will be different and sort of like specifics. But obviously, like they will both be truthful to some degree. So try to find where they both align, and then like you'll get the most accurate news story, I guess. But yeah, I agree that diversifying your news sources is a great way.
I agree with diversifying news sources, but regarding socialization, I also kind of believe that people are kind of afraid to speak about politics, which is kind of concerning, because I truly believe my opinions, and I feel like I have kind of interpreted other people's opinions and vice versa by simply having a conversation with other people. I think that's just as humans, we develop different perspectives by a simple conversation, but I feel as if so many people are afraid to have an open dialogue and fear of alienating themselves or offending anyone else. So I think just kind of restoring decorum and be willing to learn more and just openly converse with others might be a way to diversify opinions.
Great question. Do we have other questions? Well, we technically have the room for 10 more minutes if we want to entertain any final. Oh, yes, Marcelo.
Be entertaining, since I have to leave and catch the coach pretty soon. About diversity, I remember years ago, Brown County made English the official language. It was a time in which we started to get Latinos. And Professor Ortiz and Dr. Coates, who is one of the few African-American professors here on campus from the English department, and myself, we went down there to give our point of view as to why this is not a good idea to make English the official language of Brown County. I couldn't think of any other language it could be but English. But what was the real reason behind all the time and resources that Brown County supervised instead of making our roads safer and all this kind of thing? They go all this time to make something that's so obvious. And so one board member looked straight at Dr. Coates and he said, if you want diversity, go to Milwaukee. And so with that, I leave you. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. That's quite an exit, Marcelo. I feel like I should drop my microphone for him. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking when Aaron said that during the 1950s it was the most bipartisan compromise cooperation we had ever seen, and since then it's been on the decline. And I think there's something about us having a natural desire for an enemy, and we actually kind of like and crave mocking and antagonizing. And we used to have people with the pitchforks, but now maybe it's a Twitter takedown, but we like it. And so there's something, I think there's a dark nature within ourselves as humanity that we also need to look at regarding polarization, that why do we need such an enemy? And in the 1950s, we had this very clear enemy, but it was the Soviet Union, and it was communists, and it made everything very simple, so it could be us versus them in a different part of the world, or communists, people accused of communism here. But now it's more like the us and them is really Democrats and Republicans. So we have a different enemy, but we really like to take them down. We like to see our opponent, dragged. So I just would encourage, I guess, people thinking about, is there anything we can do for our own role, or how we see that play out, in those around us, to keep a check on that craving and that thirst for blood, metaphorically, right, of the opponent or of the enemy. Any final thoughts anyone has about tonight's topic? We'll end with bloodthirst for the enemy. That's a very dark way to end, but I had to top Marcelo, I guess, because of his grand exit. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and for those who were listening through our YouTube channel. And I just want to conclude by another special thanks for not only political science and public administration programs here tonight, but to the Weidner Center and to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for supporting this event. And right now, for those of you that are here, we actually have free refreshments and treats that will be available right in Studio 1, so you can make your way and help yourself. Thanks again.